The world was, in my opinion, more connected in the ancient times. The nations were more active together, trading and knowing the different traditions, even from the pre-dynastic time. And that will lead us to the to the Gosford Glyphs, because it is about that same subject.
Right.
Because it proves that ancient civilizations traveled across the ocean.
Well, we've seen.
Hello everyone, my name is Ben, this is the UnchartedX channel, and this is my investigation of the Gosford Glyphs. If you haven't heard of the Gosford Glyphs before, then you're in for quite the tale. If you have heard of them, as I'm sure many of you have, then you might want to watch this video anyway, as we're going to get into some of the new evidence and new analysis that's recently been done on the site, work that's happened in the fairly recent past, and work that draws some very interesting conclusions as to the authenticity of the site. This new analysis challenges all previous claims about the Gosford Glyphs on both sides of the argument. The so-called Gosford Glyphs are a set of carved, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that have been made into a remote sandstone outcropping in the central coast of New South Wales in Australia. They're named after the nearby township of Gosford. They're also known as the hieroglyphs, after the traditional Aboriginal name for the region. The hieroglyphs themselves aren't particularly well made. They certainly don't show the skill that you'll find on the tombs of Egypt, but there are quite a lot of them. Some roughly 300 different symbols, written high up on both sides of this protected and hard-to-find canyon in the bush. These glyphs have been surrounded by controversy since the site was first discovered. There are verified and documented accounts of this site back in the 1970s, but we also have anecdotal reports of the site going as far back as the early decades of the 1900s. Naturally, if you Google the Gosford Glyphs or look it up on establishment websites like Wikipedia, they'll confidently report to you that they're nothing more than a hoax, a collection of random symbols, carved into rocks by some enthusiastic Australian pranksters that must have visited the Middle East at some point, perhaps soldiers returning from World War I. It turns out, however, that there is much more to the site than just a collection of random glyphs. A lot of the recent controversy surrounding the glyphs has to do with a translation that was made, I think, sometime in the early 2010s, at least as best as I can tell. And while this made the supposed prank a far more sophisticated one than simply a set of random symbols, this translation led to more questions than answers, and the accuracy of the translation and the credentials of the translator were, frankly, highly suspect. Ultimately, this translation, the one that you'll find when you Google the site, it's really all over the internet, it only seemed to provide more evidence that the glyphs were nothing more than an elaborate hoax. I have not been able to find any information that this widespread translation, the one you'll find all over the internet of the Gosford Glyphs, has been verified or that it's been confirmed by any other source. However, in recent years, the Gosford Glyphs has been the subject of significant new research and analysis by Egyptian experts, and a new translation of parts of the glyphs has been made. This translation is different to the earlier one, and it's been demonstrated publicly and quite literally, glyph by glyph, word by word, to be accurate. If you have access to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, you can follow along and do this translation for yourself. It's repeatable and provable, and these are the very best conditions for good science. This translation and the analysis of the glyphs themselves have led to some startling new conclusions. According to these experts, not only do the glyphs tell a coherent story, one that explains the crude nature of the work and the odd location to find evidence for ancient Egyptians, but it provides strong evidence for dating the work to a very different period of time than the one claimed by so many articles about it on the internet. If these claims and this story are true, then it could have far-reaching consequences for what we think we know about the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So, are the Gosford Glyphs an enigmatic clue from our past? Or are they simply an elaborate hoax perpetrated on an all-too-willing public, and one that has been running for decades, if not a century at this point? I visited this interesting place myself over a couple of days in February of 2020, and I also put the call out on my channel to see if there was anyone interested in coming along to join me. So a big thank you to all the folks that did make the trip out to the Glyphs to see it with me. You guys made the experience all the more enjoyable. The Gosford Glyphs are not the easiest place in the world to find. Although there is a walking track nearby, they are well off any of the many trails in the area, and there's no signage indicating where to look. You have to do some reading up of some other first-hand accounts on the internet before you go. The glyphs are in a very well-protected section of what is a large sandstone outcropping. The first day here, we really struggled to find it, and we ended up climbing right to the top of the sandstone hill, past many similar sandstone outcroppings, and then we went back down over the other side of the hill, ultimately homing in on some GPS coordinates of the actual location. The entire area is remarkably beautiful natural bushland that thankfully wasn't affected by the recent fires in Australia. There are some wonderful colours in areas of eroded sandstone, and near the glyphs themselves there is a huge, gnarly old ghost gum, or maybe it's a bloodwood tree. I'm certainly no expert. All I can tell you is that it's a hell of an impressive tree. Even when you're in the general area of the glyphs, finding the glyphs themselves requires a bit of searching around for the entrance, and from a hoax perspective, it strikes me as a fairly obscure place to stage something like this. If I were trying to prank the public, I'd put my glyphs somewhere more visible, but instead these seem to have been placed in an area where they were likely to be well protected from the elements, but quite hard to find unless you quite literally stumble upon this small crevice in the sandstone.
This is the Gosford Glyphs. You can see it's in a sandstone sort of canyon, if you like, that's somewhere up here north of Gosford, or I guess north of Sydney. Really interesting spot to find. We've just, don't mind the soaking wetness, we've just decided to climb up all the way over the hill and take the long way around to try and find this place. It's not the easiest thing in the world to find, but we went for a bit of a hike and got the old heart rate going, and I've just gotten off a plane after about 30 hours of travelling and come from winter into a humid summer, where this is the one break in the weather that we've got over the next couple of days to film, so it's nice to get it done, but it is hot and humid. It's an interesting spot. It's hard to tell if it's genuine or not. There's a lot of stories about it. There's lots of stories on both sides. Some people think it's a hoax, other people don't. It is carved into sandstone. It's not done particularly well, but the thing that strikes me is that it's a plausible story, because not only is it just a collection of hieroglyphs, it's not just a random collection of hieroglyphs. It actually tells a story, and if you've ever tried to study hieroglyphs, you know there's decades of work in trying to do something like this to put together a story. And this has actually been translated by friends of mine, Yusuf and Muhammad. You've seen them on the channel, and they've, it basically tells a story of a shipwrecked crew. What's that? The sirens? I don't know if you can hear sirens. We're not too far from town. You get here, it's about a 15-minute walk. Well, if you do it our way, it's about a half an hour walk, including over the top of a hill and back again, but about a 15-minute walk from where you can park up. To me, it's a plausible story, though. The Egyptians had big boats, they had bigger boats than the Vikings. They were ship-going boats. They had tall prows. If you look at the boats in the museum, in the boathouse in front of the pyramids, you'll see that they had giant boats, and it's quite plausible that they were out at sea and they got lost and shipwrecked and put up here. And one of the reasons that I think it could be legitimate is that, I believe this was supposedly written by the ship's captain, who is somebody that would have understood hieroglyphs, been able to read them, but not necessarily write them very well. To be a scribe or somebody that makes your classic sort of hieroglyphs, you'd have to, that's an artisan career. That's something you did as a profession. But this, to me, this strikes me as somebody that was familiar with hieroglyphs could read it as a language and possibly didn't really know how to scribe it into stone very well. And this is what the result might be, but it's all the way up both sides of these rocks. Goes up further behind here. There's stories that suggest it could be a hoax. Some people report seeing people working in here as the 70s and earlier, but something that strikes me is that, and I'm not an expert when it comes to sandstone, but you see the patina of the rock where the moss grows, where there's colouring on the rock. It also covers the areas that have been carved. So whatever's grown on the rock or whatever effects happen to the rock, it's also happened over time to the carving. So these aren't fresh, but whether or not they're thousands of years old, that's always going to be difficult to tell. But I think the official story says that they're a hoax. Walking through the Gosford Glyphs, as you turn this corner, this beautiful sandstone, just rocky gully, tricky to find, but there's lots of other areas and caves and possible areas to explore. Not that I'm doing that right now. But this is where the glyphs start. They're on both sides of the walls. They go up quite high. As you can see here, they start here, and then you kind of have to step a little carefully. Whoop. Water drops hitting my camera. It's always good. There's a boat, water. I guess this is telling the story. See the patina of the rock? Yeah. Well, here, there's something here too. I don't know what it is. But you see there's, in areas like here, see in these little stripes, you see it in other areas where the moss has grown into the glyphs. So I don't know how long it takes. This too, like this sort of moss, it's actually grown into the carvings. So it's sort of contemporary with the rock face. So, but it is sandstone. It's not hard to work. It is a beautiful spot though.
In 2014, the Gosford Glyphs were studied in detail by Muhammad Ibrahim and Yusuf Awan, both Egyptologists, guides, and fluent and well-studied hieroglyphic experts. If you've seen some of the videos on my channel before, you'll be familiar with both of these guys. If ever you want a qualified guide to give you a real picture of Egypt, I'd highly recommend hiring either of them. My mate Luke and I interviewed them both in 2016, and we spent some time discussing the Gosford Glyphs. Before we get into the recent translation and analysis of the glyphs, which I think provides the most compelling evidence for a re-evaluation of this site, I want to lay out a couple of small pieces of context. Firstly, as I mentioned before in the glyphs themselves, the Egyptians had boats and ships.
It is known. It is known.
In fact, they had huge boats, and they had them in their culture for a long, long time. The pharaoh Khufu's solar boat, which is on display today in the boathouse next to the Great Pyramid, is massive. It's nearly 44 meters long, or around 145 feet. That's far longer than the ships used by Christopher Columbus. It's nearly twice the size. And this ship is bigger than the ships that were used by the Vikings and by many other seafaring cultures. This boat also comes from the earliest era of the dynastic Egyptians, the 4th dynasty, and their civilization extended for more than 2,000 years after this. The boats also had sails and oars. Up to 50 or more sets were found on a single ship. This culture was a seafaring one. The Egyptians had contact with other ancient cultures. They regularly brought back artifacts and materials to Egypt from across oceans. In the Temple of Hatshepsut, there are depictions and records of her taking a fleet of ships on an expedition to somewhere called Puntland. While we're not quite sure where Puntland was, it clearly required a long voyage by sea. The depictions in the temples show sea creatures like swordfish, squid, and lobsters under their boats. In modern times, Thor Heyerdahl proved that ancient boat designs were capable of covering long distances. He navigated and sailed some 8,000 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean in a handmade reed boat, which was basically a raft, named the Ra-2.
If Thor Heyerdahl was able to cross the ocean with a reed boat, then definitely bigger ships can.
So how can we accept this theory and we denied that the ancient Egyptians, they were great navigators.
Nobody can deny that the ancient Egyptians knew the star constellations from the very, very ancient times.
And we were wondering how come we can, at the whole world, we accept that he traveled all around the world with this boat, and they denied that the Egyptian can sail with what they call it the solar boat, which is 46 meters long, which is considered as a huge boat.
Almost 50 meters.
So
bigger than the
Christopher Columbus boats.
And in Hatshepsut temple, there are sea-going ships, not just. We believe these other ones is too big also for the river, but the evidence of and when we see the signs of a river or a canal, we only see the reed boats sailing, but not these bigger ships.
And there is a fact happened that Hatshepsut sailed to an African country, Puntland, which we cannot specify where exactly, but it's somewhere like in the east side of Africa, or it could be somewhere else, But she sailed. She took a whole fleet, not just one boat or two or three. It was a fleet we can count till 12 boats at least.
At least 12 big ships.
And they were big ships. It was a trading mission.
You can see lines, and then the lines on the walls shows like that it's not just one boat. There is line of boats, 3-dimensional. And
the ships went to Lebanon for the cedar wood from the early beginning of the Egyptian civilization.
Secondly, amongst several connections one can find between ancient Egypt and ancient Australia, perhaps the strongest one is the fact that boomerangs are known to have been used in ancient Egyptian culture. Famously, there were boomerangs discovered in the great unspoiled treasure hoard of King Tutankhamun, but they were also known to exist as far back as the Old Kingdom, and many of these are on display in the museums. Further, the Egyptians' name for the boomerang directly translates to foreigner's weapon.
And we have geology maps. We have a map for the world from 3000 to 100 BC. Definitely, it's not Egypt, just Egypt. But you can see the famous pre-dynastic style of the boat, of the ship in Egypt with the many oars, and the different other styles, and people fighting lions on that side, and what looks like horses,
like North America,
like North America, and what the island on the side that definitely looks like Australia, and then ancient Greece.
As if they give the famous mark to each region. What they are famous with. African, they put lions. North America, they put horses.
So what do you think?
And what supports this, that there are artifacts brought from different countries from the pre-dynastic time, which means, of course, they were traveling.
And that ancient map from the first dynasty shows many nations, and they call that the first or the oldest map of the world, because we can. Nobody said that, but we can feel that this is Africa, this is Europe, this is North and South America, this is Asia, and there are at least 8 boats sailing in each corner.
Different style of boats. And the man with a boomerang. This map is 3200 BC, official timeline.
What do they say about the boomerang when you see it in hieroglyphs?
It's foreigner's weapon. That's what they call it. Even that we have it from the Old Kingdom time in many depictions.
Labeled as
many
foreign.
scenes in the walls.
They're in the museum.
Yes.
And on the walls and known as am'at. In hieroglyphics it's called am'at. And also the other thing about Hatshepsut temples, the scenes shows like that these people, or like you will understand that these people, they didn't just sail once, because to document every creature that's sailing, that's underwater in the sea, that means you know exactly where you're going. You have seen this, big turtles and squads and different types of swordfish and many different types of fish. Everything is documented.
So let's get into the premise for the Gosford Glyphs, based on the most recent translation work done by Yusuf and Muhammad. Much of the reasoning you'll hear for both the authenticity and the dating of the site is based on the technical nature of the Egyptian language itself, and the form of the glyphs used in this sandstone canyon. Like every other language, Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved over time. Particular symbols changed in style and form from the Old Kingdom through the Middle and New Kingdoms and into the Greek-Roman period, which was the end of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. It's also a tremendously complex language, one of the very hardest of written languages to study and understand. There are quite literally thousands of symbols representing various sounds, names, words or concepts. It's not just a simple 26-character alphabet like English. Also, context matters. How these symbols are grouped can change their meaning into different words based on the other symbols that are around them. Hieroglyphs can be written horizontally or vertically, and in fact both styles are represented in the work at Gosford. Based on the style of the writing, with some glyphs contemporary with the New Kingdom and the Greek-Roman period, Yusuf and Muhammad date the site to roughly around 500 BC, but likely not any earlier than this. This is contrary to the common claims that you read on the internet about the Gosford Glyphs, that seek to date the site to the Old Kingdom time of around 2500 BC. And in fact, it's this claim of dating the site to the Old Kingdom that is the source for much of the debunking that's used against it. Quite correctly, Egyptologists and academics question this older translation that dates the site to the Old Kingdom, as they also identified certain glyphs that were only used in later periods.
Okay, first of all, that our bartender in chemistry school, Patricia Ayan, someone sent her the photos of the writings, and she promised them that we're gonna have a look and see, because she heard that everyone is accusing the writings to be fake and a hoax.
Yeah.
And we decided, me and Yusuf, from the first time we had a look, and we said, okay, we will not read anything about it. We will be like, this is our first contact. So because we don't want to be corrupted or to build our opinion with somebody else.
Yeah.
So we had a look and we started to recognize the symbols as individuals, and then as words, and then as sentences.
The data wasn't enough, so Beatrice and Patricia
went to Australia
and got as much photos and videos for the entire site.
They made their private collection. They brought, it was very high resolution, so we can zoom it.
Even we together, we didn't study it together.
Each
so
one
we
did
know
the
if we're
work
going to reach
separate.
the same conclusions or not.
Okay. And till a certain point, we were 70-75% sure that this is authentic, till we found a symbol, and it doesn't match any symbol we know. It looks ancient Egyptian, but the combination of the symbol, it's unique. And it is not listed in the hieroglyphic dictionaries I have. So we were about to lose hope. Someone actually faked that symbol. Yes, it is actually two symbols creating one. The two symbols separately are listed, but that symbol, that combination is not listed. So this is the end of the line. We said, okay, someone faked this. So I was joining one of the groups of hieroglyphics on Facebook, and I posted that picture to my friends because, and that is actually the benefit of the teamwork. And I told them, guys, do you recognize the symbol? Immediately they said, yes, this is the symbol from the Greco-Roman time, or the end of the Egyptian civilization. And that is the reason how we date the writings, because of that symbol. And you recognize that the symbol M in the Old Kingdom, it's an owl. From the end of the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom, it's like a geometric shape. Okay, so when I see it, I can say this tomb is not Old Kingdom. That tomb is Middle Kingdom, or
that sign only appeared in that era.
The same. When I found that symbol from the late period, now we can understand that who wrote those glyphs from that era or later on, but not before. Okay.
I want to mention something here. Before that, he gave that symbol because it's not listed in the dictionary to understand the meaning. But he found it first in one of the Greco-Roman temples. And he pointed and he said, that's that glyph that we cannot find in the dictionaries. Here it is, it's on the walls.
Written
so
on
it
the
has to be authentic. But we were looking in the wrong dictionaries. So the dictionaries that we were studying is the one of the classic Old Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. But that era is actually, most of the hieroglyphic in it is sometimes not the symbols are not meaning the same thing,
Right.
which was more difficult, of course, for us to translate. But we found really complicated words. Like we know words.
Shaft.
Yeah,
We found a
this
word
word shaft.
from 6 letters.
Yeah, 6
And,
different signs to make one word.
Luke asked me a question. We were in front of some hieroglyphic text. Can I read all of it? Okay. I said immediately like this, no. I can recognize like maybe from 20 to 50%. But the whole thing, I still need the dictionary. Because I can't memorize all the symbols. It's stuff and the combinations,
And
which
the
is
combination.
can create hundreds of thousands of combinations.
yeah.
So I still need the dictionary.
Thousands of signs. It's not
So
just alphabet.
That
You
is
know,
led us that who made the writings could be a real ancient Egyptian or a very talented professor in all the eras of the ancient Egyptian language. And of course, a talented professor will not do that hoax because we don't have a story about a name or somebody. All the stories about school students, drunk students, some soldiers who did that hoax.
They were not gonna do this. Like some soldiers who've been here in the Middle East and saw glyphs, so they try to imitate. That's not gonna work because they just gonna remember
You would have to
words
have-
that
You
complicated.
have to have either a really advanced understanding.
Yeah.
Right.
And if it's a professor, if it's a
Or-
professor, he was going to choose the academic style and put very famous formulas, not something
Copy.
in that
He
kind
will
of,
copy a
of
text.
rare language. Yeah.
And we didn't find that this text matches any text we know.
No,
Okay.
it's not in any. Even that we have famous stories about sailors who survived. We thought it could be that somebody copied part chapter of that story, but no, it's not. It's a different style of writing, rare, and we have horizontal and vertical writings in Gosford.
Becoming proficient at hieroglyphs truly is the work of a lifetime. It requires decades of study. I have a copy of Wallace Budge's 2-volume Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary. I purchased these books in Luxor, and I occasionally use them to try and identify individual symbols or cartouches. But I'm not naive enough to imagine that I could achieve much more than this without tremendous effort and study, and frankly, I'm just too busy doing other research and making videos. Given that the Gosford Glyphs do in fact tell a coherent story, made up from a large collection of around 300 glyphs, for this to have been a prank would require much more than just some bored Australian larrikin or a motivated soldier returning from the war with photographs and thoughts of hieroglyphs. Bear in mind also that it wasn't until after 1915 that the first versions of Egyptian dictionaries were even available. Before that, it was probably maybe 50 or 100 people worldwide that had access to manuscripts or any other translation material to work with this ancient language. To put this so-called hoax together would require a full-blown savant or a talented professor of Egyptology with a lifetime of study behind them. Even then, as you'll see, there are many nuances in the carving of the Gosford Glyphs that seem to rule out this possibility altogether. This nuance that's contained in the glyphs and the details of the full translation symbol by symbol is explained in depth by Yusuf and Muhammad in a 3-part documentary on the Chematology YouTube channel. There is also an accounting of their work in an academic paper written by Muhammad Ibrahim that you can find on academia.org, and I've got links to both the paper and the videos below in the description. There are a couple of points from this paper and this video that are worth mentioning here. Firstly, for many hieroglyphs, there are several ways one can write them. Some have a very common, or you might say famous, way of writing, with rare and obscure variations being recorded here and there, like when the symbol is reversed or altered in some form. If you were a professor or an Egyptologist creating this prank, you would obviously use the common or more famous form of a particular glyph. What's interesting about Gosford is that we see the exact opposite happening with several of these glyphs, with the rarer or more obscure form of the hieroglyph being used, as shown in this excerpt from the academic paper. Secondly, and this might blow your mind a little when you think about it, in the videos on their channel, Yusuf mentions that some of the symbols they found at Gosford have only recently been added to Egyptian dictionaries, and some of them as recently as 2012. So understand what that means. That before 2012, the translation for a particular sign was simply not available in any hieroglyphic dictionary, yet we have verified accounts of the Gosford Glyphs going back to the 1970s, as well as anecdotal accounts of them back to the early 1900s. How exactly does that work, assuming it's a prank? How can the premise of a prank account for symbols at Gosford that weren't even translated until this current decade that we're in now? If you are interested in the full blow-by-blow details of the translation, I'd highly recommend checking out the full 3-part video on the Chematology channel. Not that many people have seen these videos, and their channel only has 800 subs. It's both good content and I think it's important work, so please do take the time to subscribe to their channel and give them some support. There were 2 authors identified in the glyphs: Nejet Sobet, who was a sailor, and Netta Sobet, the chief sailor, likely the captain of one of the ships. The Sobet in their names is probably a reference to their profession or to that particular group, a common way of writing one's name and profession together in ancient Egypt, in this case of sailors, and you can see the glyph in the names. This makes sense to me when you see the somewhat poor quality of the glyphs themselves. These are people that had a working knowledge of the language, but had likely never drawn or carved into stone.
And when it comes to carving it, I realized also that the person who carved it didn't follow the school of what we see here on the professional scribes, which is drawing the symbols and then carving them. We've seen examples of that in the Egyptian Museum of Unfinished Work.
Yes.
But he carved the symbols right away, and that's very, very, very challenging. To carve the symbol right away if you are not used. Try to carve English, and you'll see how crude that comes out.
Yes.
Huh? And you still know the language very well. And the symbols or the letters in English is not as complicated as. So we find like signs, the chick, for example, the squale, there is the lower, the back side leg is always have a
bend of the back side of the knee.
Yeah, he did that.
Yes.
We were starting to see like this kind of things. So it was hard to find because he wrote the chapter. One chapter was.
No, I want to explain this more. So it is someone who is used to write this, not just someone like if I'm gonna write this, I will make it 2 straight legs and like a scratching for the feet. Okay, but if I write Arabic, because I write Arabic or English all the time, especially Arabic because it is wavy writings. In Arabic, we have certain angle and certain wave for each letter. The same like ancient Egyptian. Yeah. So that man who drew the check, he was doing this all the time. So he made that back side or the bend of the knee. So it proves that that is his language, not just someone.
He knows certain curves in the symbols. Without it, it's not the symbol. Like another symbol, where that it's assembled with a little bird, but the tail of the bird
like a sparrow,
must have like a specific shape.
The feather and the tail,
not just a bird. So any normal person that was just going to copy something, especially on stone, he was not gonna like do this kind of work. Plus, we translated already the part that was horizontal, vertical. The vertical part was a correct formula of Jid Midu. Remember the Jid Midu? Yeah, it's written. Yeah, so Jid Midu without in. So that was confusing. But when we were looking, now that we dated the writings, we looked around the same writings in that era that we believe the writings is from the similar era, and we found that in some cases Jid Midu without
the same
in.
combination.
Huh? So yes, it's there. Letters that's back to back. It's not all facing the same direction. We found also, and it's an Isis temple. And it's not a mistake.
It's
no,
a design.
it's a style.
Design,
Yes, it's a style.
The Gosford Glyphs tells a story about a fleet of ships that were heading north, returning to Egypt, that then ran into a very strong storm. They were forced to turn around, presumably back to Australia. The weather was so bad that the fleet was shipwrecked. Ships were capsized, flipped upside down, and most of the expedition died, with only a few survivors making it ashore. These survivors mentioned the local inhabitants of what they called Pinu land as having no deception, and they marked this location as the grave or the tomb for those that were killed. One of the authors thanked Horus for surviving the accident, and they called on their gods to hide the entrance to the graves, and they invoked eternal life for the deceased in the heritage of Egypt as their homeland.
Then, of course, we looked at the story, the bigger text. So we chose one of the walls because it's a lot, and it's there's lots of symbols, and probably some chapters are not connected, but more than one. And we have to put in mind that he's not a professional scribe. He's a sailor. And back in these days, to know how to read and write, that was something, not everybody could do.
Not easy.
Yeah, until not long time
So
ago.
he wrote his name, he wrote his profession, and he
Yeah.
wrote the story, and that is the most interesting part of this, that he was talking about expedition, and he wrote the name of the captain. Okay, they call him the chief captain, or the chief of. So we can make differences between the chief of the expedition, let's say like a mayor or like a royal relative, and then the captain of the fleet. Okay, so he wrote the name of the captain of the fleet, and he was talking about the fleet coming back to Egypt from Australia. Actually, they didn't mention the names in a very clear way, but this is how we understand the writings, that they were leaving and heading north.
Yeah.
Okay, and then
return.
a kind of a very strong storm or like a
Yeah.
tsunami happened, so they had to return back to the place, which is Australia, and they call it Benu land, BNU, Benu land. Okay, and they had to return back. In their journey back, the very strong
Rainstorm,
waves
yeah.
happened, rainstorm and waves,
Yeah.
and the ships were
Capsized.
hiked and upside down and were destroyed.
Yeah.
Okay, and it seemed that him and the captain are survivors. Maybe a priest. We found that there is a priest also listed. And in the future, we're gonna continue translating the whole thing, so we will come up with the whole story.
Yeah, that chapter that we translated is in YouTube videos, and we have
3 hours. Yes, 3
at
videos.
least.
Each one
We
is
have,
1
yeah,
hour.
we have 3 parts. So in the beginning, we had to prove how would they travel and all this stuff. But if somebody wants to see the translation, is in part 3.
Part 2 and part 3.
Yeah.
Analysis
part 2
of
is the
Gosford
gathering of the
Glyphs.
symbols, but part 3 is most and also the rest of, inshallah, we're gonna have time. But the fact that they say professionals looked at these writings and they said it means nothing, that proves that it's authentic. Because it meant something, and we both understood it, and we put it down in the documentary that we did about it with every word and its codes in the dictionary. This word is made out of these 3 symbols, for example, and these 3 symbols are this code and that code. Nobody can deny what the work we did is, if they really want to know. But how would they travel, and how would they, this is we already said how did they travel. And the boomerangs, for example. How come Egyptians and Australians have boomerangs, and why we call it the foreigner's weapon?
And by saying that the sailor who made it, no, of course we didn't imagine this because of the writings. Okay, so we answered another question, that maybe the grammatic structure will not be so perfect.
Yeah.
And who will do this? If I call anybody from any nation, write a text for me or a story, the grammar from Egypt, from United States, from France, everyone with his own language, he will not give me a grammar structure in a very good way. Okay, so as Yusuf said, that someone be able, a sailor, and that is And we understand that the Egyptian studies or the Egyptian education used to happen through the temple.
Yes.
It was as a religious education first, and from being a priest, they will be study different subjects. Okay, so most of or maybe all of the writings in the Egyptian temples and the tombs done by whom? By the professional scribes. So no way to compare between the Gosford Glyphs writings or the glyphs of Gosford and the glyphs in the Egyptian temples.
Yeah.
This done by a sailor in a random shape, and the one was in a different, maybe emotional case, and the professional scribes who wrote.
We know that they make the horizontal and vertical lines.
They have time,
to
of
lay
course.
everything
They have the right
perfectly
tools.
and everything like that. But when it comes to crude writings, we also found lots of crude writings that like very similar to what you find in Gosford. We found also hieroglyphic graffiti, especially there is one especially that actually it's a match for Gosford, and this one is in the chapel or in the
Sekhmet.
Sekhmet.
Yes.
Remember that Petah, there is a figure of Petah
In Karnak temple,
Karnak
when you go
temple.
to Sekhmet,
He has no head.
yes, but
not
not
the
inside the shrine. It's outside on
one
the left
local
wall.
carved that on the wall
Yes.
at once.
Because in Gosford there is a kind of, if I can call it, like cartoon character of Betah, with a big belly,
Yes.
and his hands comes out. When we see it, we understand what it is. But some people maybe think that this is a funny shape of Betah. At that chapel we are talking about, the same shape is, or Betah was represented in that style again.
We're not exaggerating.
Yeah,
The same.
copy of it.
So as if you're looking, and it's as crude as the one in Gosford actually, and it's almost on the same type of poor sandstone. So it also survived for at least from 300, 400 BC. Yeah.
The same timeline.
Not all of these glyphs were translated by Yusuf and Muhammad, but a solid chapter of those found on the right-hand side wall were. The images and the translation that you'll hear are sourced from both the academic paper and Yusuf and Muhammad's video on the Chematology channel. When converted more or less into plain English, the translation reads as follows. Quote, "The ruler and the chief of the foreign land Pinu have no deception." End quote. This is pretty clearly to me a reference to both Australia as Pinu land and also to the locals living there, presumably Aboriginals. Quote, "When the storm and the north wind blow up again, captains turned around to the south." End quote. So this is referring to the direction they were sailing. They were obviously sailing to the north, and then there is a reference that they specifically returned to where they came from, and in this case to the south. So they were also returning to, I guess, where they were before that, which presumably was Australia. Quote, "The ships capsized, they turned over and were destroyed into pieces. We prayed to our gods for help, but many were killed." End quote. This basically tells you the story of what happened when they turned around and the story of the storm. They called out to their gods for help. That's what the praise glyph is. This is normal behavior for people and religious cultures like the Egyptians. When bad stuff happens, you ask your gods for help. The fall glyph here specifically makes reference to being killed or being knocked down dead. You can also see a glyph of an upside down boat here. Quote, "The powerful, precious Horus protected God's servant by his light during the dark moment." End quote. Now, this is essentially one of the authors, in this case I think it was Nejet Sobet. He's linking himself with his god, who was Horus. He's thanking him for saving him during this dark moment. He calls himself specifically the Neterhem, which essentially means servant of Horus. This is basically gratitude to the gods for saving his life. Quote, "God will keep the hidden burial from being reached and give the foreign land heritage." End quote. What this essentially tells you is that the site was being prepared or was being used as a burial for those who died in the shipwreck. And they're also giving the land the Egyptian heritage, the traditions. They're giving them the same sort of homeland, a touch of Egypt, if you like, for the afterlife. Quote, Eternal life to the deceased will be given power in this place. End quote. So again, this is invoking the death and religious traditions of the dynastic Egyptians, and we could be talking about a singular or a multiple burial. It doesn't really make it clear which one it is, but both cases existed in ancient Egypt, although it was more often the single one. But in this case, given the circumstances that most of the crew died and only a couple of survivors, it seems to me that it's more likely that it's a multiple burial. So that's a significant chapter of the writing that's on the right-hand side wall at Gosford, and it took Yusuf and Muhammad a lot of their own time and effort in order to do this. No one was paying them to do it. They have said that they do intend to work on the rest of the translation in the future, but like everyone, I'm sure they're also very busy with business, family, and daily life. So now let's take a look at the other side of this coin. This site has been talked about as a hoax for decades, and it's routinely scoffed at by academics and Egyptologists. Given the nature of the glyphs and the nature of this recent translation, I think we can rule out the idea that it's just a random prank made up of, just a random assortment of glyphs. So let's address some of the other common objections that you'll hear. It is carved into sandstone, and sandstone does indeed erode over time, but not all sandstone is the same. There is in fact a glyph here that accurately calls the walls as sandstone. It's the same glyph for sandstone that we find in Egypt itself, so whoever did this knew what type of material they were working in. These walls feel very hard to the hand, and they're really quite well protected from the elements, and perhaps this had something to do with the choice of location, as the whole site is really quite difficult to find, and you can see it's not really eroding so much as there is stuff growing all over it. In fact, this whole canyon was reportedly at one point completely filled with rubble and rocks, and it had to be emptied. Now, if I were pranking the public, I wouldn't really care about erosion, and I wouldn't want to hide my stunt away in some obscure and difficult location. I'd want to see the results of my prank and have my work noticed in, let's say, within 10 to 20 years. So I'd carve these in a much more visible and more public location, and who cares about erosion over time? Now, you can't rule out the idea that the site has been tampered with, and in fact, I think that it definitely has been. There are some indications of modern vandalism, pretty typical Australian work enhancing the dick glyph like it's some sort of high school toilet block, and there are pictures from the 80s that show that parts of the site have in fact been altered. These alterations are notably to the large figure, this carving of Anubis, and not to the glyphs themselves, and this is an important distinction. I looked closely at the carving of the large Anubis, and it does not seem to have the same patina or growth as the actual written language portions of the site. So I certainly think that there's some nuances here. It's not all black and white. It's not all a case of it's all genuine or it's all fake. I think the answer is somewhere in between. Also, the glyphs or the written language part of the site are primarily carved into the upper walls. You would need scaffolding, or at least a ladder to get up there. The known altered parts of this site, like the large Anubis, are at the ground level, and they're easily accessible to anyone with a penknife. And no advanced hieroglyphic knowledge is necessary to do this, just a mild artistic talent and a disregard for anything remotely sacred in the world. I briefly before mentioned this earlier translation that was done. You can easily find it for yourself on the internet. This translation tells some sort of Wilbur Smith river god-esque story of the tombs of the sons of Khufu, the princes, who were somehow on the ship and then they died and were interred in Australia. The basis for this translation may well be the fact that the cartouches of both Seneferu and Khufu, or Cheops if you prefer it Greek, are represented on the walls at this site, and I expect that this is the source for the earlier Old Kingdom dating. Sneferu and Khufu were the early rulers of the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, but this really doesn't rule out Yusuf and Muhammad's dating of the site to around 500 BC, or even later, as Seneferu and particularly Khufu were some of the most respected and revered pharaohs of all of ancient Egypt. They were mentioned constantly throughout the civilization. We have examples of their names being used right down through to the 26th dynasty. And in fact, it's from 26th dynasty tombs at Abydos that the only statue of Khufu has ever been found. This is the tiny 4-inch figure that's on display in the Cairo Museum. We find Khufu's name carved into mines from Egypt to Sudan, so it's no real surprise to also find it represented at the Gosford Glyphs. Ultimately, this is one of those historical mysteries that will likely never be 100% settled in either direction. It's always going to be controversial. This site has many different accounts, stories, claims, and it's really quite the tale. Despite this, in my mind, it comes down to what is the more plausible story, when we take a look at the known and provable context and facts, and then we apply some basic logic. So, on one hand, you have the dynastic Egyptians, an ancient seafaring culture known to make large ocean-going vessels, doing this for thousands of years, and of which we have some real examples, like the solar boat next to the pyramid. There are documented records of this culture doing exactly that, sailing oceans and trading with other ancient cultures all around the world. They had connections to the ancient Aboriginal Australian culture that you can see for yourself in the museums, all of the boomerangs. And this expedition might have been exploring the world, or they even might have been on a regular trade route and were shipwrecked by bad weather. Now, this is a day wrecker, but it definitely happens. The few survivors of this storm marked their presence and the event, and they marked the passing of their fellows as best they could in the language of the day, likely with some help from the local inhabitants. No high technology required. We're not talking about lost ancient high civilizations here, just a logical extension of the known facts of an existing and well-known ancient culture. The translation of a large part of the Gosford Glyphs is publicly available, symbol by symbol, for anyone that wants to follow along with a hieroglyphic dictionary and verify it for themselves. The style of these glyphs matches the dating made by the experts of somewhere around 500 BC. If this story is indeed true, then it opens up new avenues of research into what we think we know about ancient cultures and how far they travelled. If indeed this story is true, then this is a truly remarkable find, and the site should be studied and protected, as sadly there is clear evidence of both alterations and vandalism to the work on the site today. On the other hand, we have the idea that it's a prank, a hoax, a giant joke on enthusiastic and all too willing to believe members of the public. Given that the translation is essentially unassailable proof of the complexity of the work, I think we can dismiss the idea that it was simply university students or returning soldiers from World War I, or anyone else that thought it'd be a good idea to randomly scroll down a bunch of Egyptian-looking stuff and have a giggle. At least part of this work is undeniably a coherent story. Even if someone had managed to somehow construct this complex tale in a dead and difficult language as some sort of joke, there are significant holes in this theory that need addressing, particularly as related to the style of some of the glyphs. Why were the rarest forms of some of these glyphs used instead of the more famous, more common, and more well-known versions? Not to mention the fact that we know this site was here in the 1970s, yet some of the symbols on the wall weren't actually decoded by Egyptology establishment and put into the dictionaries until after the year 2010. You would basically need to be a time-traveling professor of Egyptology with decades of study behind you and a savage penchant for long-term practical joking, as well as the will to haul ladders into weirdly obscure and hard-to-reach locations in the bushland of the central coast of Australia, all on the very random chance that someone even notices what you've done in the next 30 years so you can then sit back and presumably laugh about it. I'm fairly sure I know which of these two tales is the more plausible. Alright, there it is. I hope you guys enjoyed my investigation into the Gosford Glyphs. I do want to say that if this in any way inspires you to go out to Gosford to find the glyphs yourself and to visit the site, please do treat the place respectfully. We really don't need any more destruction of, ancient records or of ancient sites anywhere in the world, and I think this goes for this, whether you or not you think this is genuine or a hoax. At this point, it's pretty much folklore, it's history for Australia, and it really does deserve our protection and our respect. Of course, I do want to say a huge thank you to Muhammad Ibrahim and Yusuf Ayawan for spending a lot of their own time and effort in doing this recent translation work. I know they've said they're interested in translating the rest of it, and certainly none of our paid academics that sit around in Egyptology departments seem to be interested in taking a closer look at it. So an idea that I had, and let me know in the comments if you agree or if you think it's worth doing, is that we could set up a GoFundMe or some other form of crowdfunding device to pay these guys for their time to actually look at decoding and translating the rest of it. I certainly think their time is worth something. And of course, and always, just a huge thank you to everybody that does choose to support the channel through the value for value model. It's the way that I try to run things around here. I really don't want to go down the route of having to, you know, do the whole, this video brought to you by this set of earbuds or this computer game or this VPN product. And I mean, those guys have been asking me, but I really want to avoid the advertising model if at all possible. So that's why I kind of choose to keep talking about the value for value model. There's lots of ways to do that, to support the channel. They're all outlined at unchartedx.com/support. And I mean, you guys are really the only reason I was able to get on that $750 Qantas special fare for a return trip to Australia and go and see family, as well as, you know, look at the Gosford Glyphs. Small bit of trivia: the first sort of few shots at the front of this video, I happened to be on the inaugural QF60 flight, which was the first time they'd been flying the route between San Francisco and Brisbane, which is why Qantas was putting on a big show and dance with mascots and giving away ginger beers and all that type of thing. So that was a little bit of fun. So thanks all you guys for that, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.
Oh, this is a 6-speed. Oh. 6 gears? I didn't know! Apparently it's a 6-speed, yeah. Back to 5th, up the hill.